Welcome back, everyone. That certainly went quickly. In this last panel, I am going to invite back our three moderators. And I think collectively we can reflect on some of the discussions, the very rich and broad-ranging discussions that we've enjoyed today, and also maybe identify a few things that we particularly feel might merit some more research, future inquiry. So welcome back, Iris, Elliot, and Kerry. Thank you so much for leading those brilliant panel discussions. I've learned an enormous amount. I started in a very disciplined way, keeping notes in my notebook, but it's kind of just become a real mess. So I'm going to try and decipher my own thoughts. But in the meantime, I wondered if you might give everyone a bit of a insight into your respective interests in glass. And Elliot, I'm going to hand over to you to go first. And we have some slides, I think, queued up for you to call.
Thanks, Kit. Hi, everybody. I'm Elliot Blair. I'm an archaeologist, primarily in the Southeastern US. But in terms of glass, I study the technology of glass bead manufacture and the circulation of glass beads in colonial contexts, particularly during the 16th and 17th centuries. I have projects going on right now in lots of places, including California, Palau and Micronesia, and Jamestown, but in Virginia. But most of my work centers on the 17th century Spanish missions of La Florida, particularly a mission Santa Catalina de Wally, located on St. Catherine's Island, just a little bit south of Savannah. And here in this first slide here, can we go back? Yeah, in this first slide here, we see a sample of the very large and diverse assemblage of glass beads that have been excavated at Mission Santa Catalina. Almost 70,000 glass beads excavated from this site. It's one of the largest and most diverse 17th century assemblages in the Americas. And there's a couple of things that are really extraordinary about this collection. One is the size and why here on this little barrier island off the coast of Georgia. St. Augustine was already during the 17th century an outpost of New Spain, and St. Catherine's Mission Santa Catalina was an outpost of this outpost. So it's sort of this far-flung reaches of the Spanish colonial world, and we have this incredibly enormous and diverse assemblage. These are beads from Venice, there are ones from the Netherlands, France, glass beads from China. Not pictured here, there's some from Bohemia, and some that we think are actually from Spain too. These ones in the bottom left corner, these gilded beads, these are ones that we think may have been manufactured in Spain. And some in the lower right image also may have been manufactured in Spain. So it's a very large and diverse assemblage coming from all over the world. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And here just as a schematic diagram, just sort of showing where all over the world this enormous assemblage is coming from. And so one of the things I look at in my work is this circulation of beads coming into the Spanish Americas. And this is sort of the macro scale of the circulation of glass beads at this time. Let's go into the next slide. And so then the other aspect of this, what I'm particularly interested in, is the micro scales of the circulation of glass. And so what we're looking at here in the upper right image, this is a scatter plot of elemental data from about 800 white glass beads that look very much like the one pictured below. All of these beads are almost visually identical. Just looking at them, you can't tell them apart, but they cluster into 5 very distinct compositional groups. And by tracing the circulations of these beads from Europe and into these Spanish mission communities in the Atlantic world, we can trace the relationships and connections between individuals in these communities. And so this somewhat a wild-looking diagram to the left, this is a social network model for from the individuals who were buried at Mission Santa Catalina, connected by the glass beads that they've had in their burials. And so these are beads that are connected by being of the same type, coming from the same glass factories, being of the same colors, and they were circulated and exchanged amongst the members of that community. And so sort of put it quite broad, put it quite simply, I'm looking at sort of the circulations of beads at the macro and the micro scale, coming into the Spanish Americas, and then how they circulate within the communities and foster connections between individuals.
Thanks, Elliot. You are the bead representative in today's session, so I definitely would like to circle back and consider beads a bit more in this discussion. But Kerry, would you like to share some of your work?
Yes, I have lots of questions for Elliot too, because I'm assistant professor of English literature, so I'm coming into glass really via literary text in the first instance, like Equiano, Robinson Crusoe, where we're looking at how glass is used in different ways. But the essay that I contributed to the Sparkling volume really started to look at the connections between slavery and glass, and to argue that the history of glass is intertwined with slavery. And my chapter really details the designation of human beings as a commodity in the period, alongside the emerging cultural significances and uses of glass. And my work on the beads draws on other bead experts like Sam Guerrero specifically, who's done a lot of work on William Davenport, who Kit mentioned in his opening talk. We're used to this sort of cultural trope of the idea that Africans were willing to sell each other for trinkets to a European market, but that's a very racist myth produced by enslavers like Edward Long and Snellgrave, who describe these as trinkets. In fact, these were highly sought after, designed specifically for specific cultural markets and in specific communities in the west coast of Africa. There was a demand for them, and some of the beads, like the ones that Kit showed in the opening talk, the more opaque designed beads, looked very similar to African beads that were called agri beads, made out of various materials. And of course, William Davenport was able to make an enormous career out of a very sophisticated trade network that bought the glass beads from Venice down to the UK and down to the west coast of Africa. And he had very many sort of merchant inquirers who would go around, travel around the West African communities, ask exactly what kind of beads communities wanted. So the beads crossed the Atlantic, as Elliot's shown, and how do we read them? And here's one image that we see, which is Piatt's engraving after Carl Friedrich von Breda's painting, and it casts the sort of bare-chested African enslaved man as certainly lesser than his clearly enlightened white-dressed planter owner. But the beads might be supposed in this image to signify the enslaved man's inferiority, but another way to read them is as a sign of cultural resistance. And I think that's something that's really come up for us today, because part of the work I think we need to keep doing is to think of what other beliefs, value systems and cultural practices pertained in Indigenous and African and Caribbean receptions of the glass objects and artifacts that were being brought to, traded with, or often sometimes even just foisted upon them, or as Alexi's paper talks about, used to examine them. So my colleague, Dr. Shelby Johnson, who's a specialist in Indigenous literatures and cultures, helped me this week with this question and shared the writings of William Apis, a peacoat, whose narrative, An Indian's Looking Glass for the White Man, is an essay that takes the trope of the mirror and reverses it to tell the white man how terrible he looks to a native gaze because of his racism. And he really uses that trope of a looking glass to mount a critique of race. So we can maybe go on to the next thing, because if that's how enslavers and traders depicted the sort of African and Indigenous consumption of glass, of course, as we've seen, the irony is that in the British world, glass was an enormous luxury and came to signify and help create the polished politeness that typified gentility and civility. And I'm really focusing in my work going forward now on how glass is used to forge whiteness. And a lot of the images have got here, we've got a sash window, a light in airy room, but we have got an enslaved figure figure in the background in Gravelot's game of quadrille. So part of the politeness is the tea in the right corner, and the black enslaved person holds a polished copper kettle. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is these are not marginal or incidental figures, they're integral because they're marginal to a forging of whiteness that depends on and is intertwined with the significations and what I'm calling the rhetoric of glass. We can go on to the next slide. I know Philippe has talked about the toilette, and others have talked about the toilette as a ritual. And I think nowhere is the link between glassiness and imperial consumption made more clear than in Canto 1 in The Rape of the Lock, where Alexander Pope gets at the violence done to objects in his use of zeugma, which is a rhetorical device that captures the violent transformations. The tortoise here and elephant unite, transformed to combs, the speckled and the white. And so in this mezzotin after Friedel, a black servant carries a carafe and a salver with tea into a gleaming Belinda who is reflected in her glass. And this ritualistic aspect is very clear, and an importance of a reflection producing 18th century high-class femininity. And both Pope and Hogarth might be thought to be, as Catherine Molyneux argues, satirizing the British consumption of artifacts as itself a type of slavishness. That's a word that Pope used. We can go on to the next slide, because here is a painting by Hogarth, portrait of a family. Again, this is a polite scene, a drawing room. But if we want to read it as satire, the violence of consumption is masked by the extreme fragility of the glassiness here, even while their focus, our ocular and satirical focus, remains on white people, because we can see in the left-hand corner a very small pair of dark-coloured hands carrying another small, silver tray, and if the glass and the tea set are all very tiny, so too is the African person, who is in chattel slavery designated as another object for consumption and another object which designates politeness. We can go on to the next slide. And again, here is this sort of dynamic more clearly. In Philippe Mercier's The Sense of Taste, the painting was one of 5 depicting the senses that Mercier completed with his wife while staying at York. The sense of sight, which is a correlating picture, indeed relied on mirrors and lenses and glasses, but here we have the sense of taste, and this is a difficult empirical sense to depict because we don't want to look greedy. So he's using the light fragility of glass to make consumption and appetite into a delicate, polite endeavor. And Anna Moran, in her essay in the collection, tells us about the sweetmeats and the dessert glasses that became very fashionable to fill up. Somebody asked earlier, fill up these light transparent glasses. And here we have the enslaved person again in the background, who is part of the scene and is there, I think, again, against which whiteness makes itself. But of course, he himself is a comment on the consumption because he's wearing a silver collar. So the sort of politeness undoes itself. And the last image I'll end with, the next slide. Thank you. I want to end with this final image of a free Black woman. We don't know her name yet, and I think more research is going into that. But she's wearing a Caribbean tignon, and it's painted by Jean-Etienne Lyotard, and it's possible she commissioned the painting herself. She has replaced the silver collar of enslavement with a necklace of Roman glass beads and possibly hand-blown bubbles of light, which are now adorning her own neck. And what's really interesting is that their pellucidity glints against her and her skin, and it seems to be a perfect medium through which we can see her brown skin. So I think this is a really interesting use of translucence from a free Black person that sort of inverts a lot of the dynamics. She's become the possessor of the culture that would objectify her. And uses some of the myths of white supremacy to claim and adorn her own self.
Thanks, Kerry. I think that the point you were making with Hannah Young as well, that the expression of taste was really, that emerged in the 18th century, the notion of taste that emerged in the 18th century really was at its heart an expression of whiteness within this kind of imperial context. And much more to discuss about that too. But Iris, would you like to go ahead now?
Sure, thanks, Kit. So I, very much like Kit, came to the context or the topic of glass through the 18th century in the British context. And here you see an image of the sort of central spinal gallery of the 18th century in the new British galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which opened in 2020, only to be shut down by COVID. Could I get the next slide, please? And what I love, though, however, is that it really gave us a chance to highlight glass in a way that it never had been before in previous iterations, where the British galleries were very much sort of tied to period rooms and sort of keeping all the furniture in the period room. By contrast, in our 18th century gallery, we sort of exploded all the objects and put them in these very glassy vitrines. Could I get the next slide, please? So you may have seen this in Kit's presentation, but glass did have a quite significant presence in England even before the 18th century, with the establishment of domestic glass houses that were trying to establish technology and production so they wouldn't have to import it from Venice. And so we do have an example as well on display in the British galleries of a tazza attributed to the Duke of Buckingham. So this would be a mixed alkali glass before they developed the technology for the lead glass, which Kit discussed in his presentation this morning. Next slide, please. And what's so remarkable is only within a span of decades, they go from, pretty good, but still sort of flawed imitations of Venetian glass to really remarkable shapes and forms and types of decoration on lead glass. As Kit mentioned, lead, because of its superior strength, is able to sort of take the engraving in a very different way than the mixed alkali and the types of glass that were being produced in Venice as well. Could I get the next slide, please? But my own interest is very much in the 18th century context, where it's less about technology and it's more about the themes that were explored in Sparkling Company. This whole idea of sparkle and polish, but really this sort of world of spectatorship and spectacle, where you're really meant to be seen and to see others. And glass, of course, plays a huge part in that. And I just love these giant blingy buckles. You might think they were belt buckles, but they're actually for your shoes. And there's a great story where the chape makers, which is the sort of implement on the back of the buckle, and the buckle makers together petitioned George III to complain about the failing markets at the end of the 18th century, because the French were essentially shutting down business because they had invented this new phenomenal thing that had destroyed their markets. And of course, what that was a shoelace, because at this point, no one had shoelaces, and the French Revolution and the revolutionaries invented that and essentially put all the buckle makers out of business. Next slide, please. I am really interested, especially in what Kit was describing as these sort of rituals of politeness and this kind of British clubby culture, which is very different for us Americans. We don't have that same sense of the clubs as organizing social life, and that very much coming out of the 18th century context. But just the variety of these glasses. And I had an interesting conversation with our conservator, Karen Stam, who helped me on this presentation, which was, we were wondering if the lead itself, because it was so much more of a durable glass, made toasting much more possible, because the thought of toasting with a Venetian glass and clinking the glass is kind of scary because it would shatter. You can just sort of imagine how they would fall apart. So something about the lead English glass, especially being conducive to toasting in that social context. Could I get the next slide, please? So again, building on this imagery, and we've seen a couple of these clubby gentlemen gatherings. We saw this morning with the Dilettanti, and I imagine the Lunar Society as well did quite a bit of toasting. I think Matthew Bolton probably opened his wine cellars for the lunatics at the time. Next slide, please. And of course, the glass being central to that form of sociability. Next slide, please. But again, I'm sort of drawn to this material in its toasting format. We've seen today how glass has been such a key part of the cultural practice of the Enlightenment, and also as a metaphor for enlightenment in terms of its transparency, luminosity, clarity, reason, rationality, technological progress. Next slide, please. And also, glass is an instrument of making politics, and again, sociability. Sorry, one more slide. But there was something especially about, so if we think about spinning out the metaphor of glass in the 18th century context, I kind of wondered too if glass might be seen furthermore as a metaphor for capitalism, which is something that we haven't addressed head on, but clearly it's something that can be seeded and kind of beaded through all the different presentations that we've seen today. Next slide, please. But specifically this notion of the 18th century as being the moment of sort of finance capitalism, right? I mean, this is the moment in which capitalism as the foundation of modernity comes into play. And I loved the demonstrations where you saw bubbles, right? And the fact that a lot of the goblets that I just showed you, those are actually building bubbles on bubbles on bubbles. So, the bowl part of the glass being one bubble set upon a maraise with the knop for another bubble, and then the foot of the goblet itself is a bubble. So essentially glass is a structure of bubbles. Next slide, please. And of course, this was a real great fascination for painters of the period, everyone from Chardin to the great scientists of the period and the physicists. Next slide, please. But again, coming back to this question of capitalism and glass as a metaphor of capitalism, how might we then tie, if we think of glass as being produced by bubbles and a structure of bubbles, how might we be able to tie that to 1720, which is essentially the first financial bubble, and a bubble that burst quite unexpectedly and with great fanfare in the prints of the period, and sort of tying those two things together in this cultural moment of the 18th century. So it's less about enlightenment per se and more about capitalism. So that's it from me.
Thanks, Iris. I love your displays in the new British galleries, the glass display with which the vessels are suspended as if they're showering down from the ceiling with lots of other little 18th century toys or tokens of modernity. I think it's so striking and effective. And I really love this notion of the bubble as well, because of course glass carries with it this imminent sense of destruction. And there's a wonderful anecdote that I've told before about Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens and being located in central London next to many of the city's glass houses, and having easy access to tableware, looking glasses, and these extraordinary lanterns, thousands of them strung from trees. And on the last night of the season, the proprietors of Vauxhall opened the gates to the mob, the London mob, who came in and smashed everything as a kind of this pressure valve for the city, which was under such kind of social, political tension, economic tension throughout the century. I really like that metaphor. But maybe I'll round out, before we get into some discussion, I'll round out maybe just by sharing a bit of my own current research. Could we go on to the next slide, 24, please? So I'm interested in the reception of glass in the Caribbean and the colonized Caribbean, particularly the British colonies during the long 18th century, and considering how the market for glass here differed to that of the metropole, to that of London or Britain, or indeed North America. This is really kind of a micro history, but I think it's worth articulating the different dynamics that defined white society in the Caribbean during this period. And this illustration, it shows you the proliferation of glass. The Caribbean was notorious, as Hannah Young mentioned, for its kind of the luxury of the white enslavers, the nihilism, the alcoholism was a noted feature, as Kerry's written about extensively. And so this created a very different kind of, a very specific market, I think, for glass that was connected very closely to the psychological and emotional history of the region. So yellow fever as well was rife in the Caribbean. It was known as the graveyard of Europe, which I think had a really profound impact on those who lived there. The threat of French invasion and the threat of rebellion of the enslaved population also, I think, affected the market for glass. Spyglasses are often referred to in contemporaneous accounts of the Caribbean, people carrying spyglasses, looking out to the horizon. I mentioned at the beginning the spyglass that was kept in the coffee house in Kingston, Jamaica. And also the influences of climate. So windows, as you see here, were typically not glazed, which meant that light candles had to be protected from breezes. Also, the climate meant that people socialized or moved around in darkness, which not only existed alongside a sense of anxiety and uneasiness among the white minority population, but it also required more lighting than possibly their metropolitan counterparts. So I think there are many ways that we can look at the Caribbean as a microhistory of glass. How glass arrived there is also interesting, and to what extent we can discover that, I'm not sure, because as Suzanne mentioned in her panel discussion, shipments were extremely, it was expensive. Merchants had to calculate the kind of the economic advantage of shipping certain items, and glass was often used to pack inside pieces of furniture, for example. So we don't often have, there aren't so many clear shipping lists just for glass. It was often sent along with other objects, incidentally. And of course, smuggling as well, the unofficial trade between islands, between Britain and Spain, Britain and France, and so on. So we have evidence from shipwrecks as well of glass, of British lead glass, that found its way to the Caribbean. I think it'll be a really interesting project to unpick this. But also to go back to Kerry's interest, the glass as a kind of expression of whiteness. Very often we see in portraits of enslaved or free women of African descent, or biracial women, they're wearing pendant earrings in the Caribbean context, I mean. And this is a kind of plantation style that was picked up by Europeans, and people like Amelia Rouser have written about this. But interestingly, while the hoop and pendant earring was taken up by European women, the gold pendant was often replaced by one of these Roman pearls, these blown glass beads. So I think there's something interesting to explore there too. But that's enough of me. I want to open up the discussion now, but I would really like to go back to you, Elliot. And I wonder if we could pull up your first slide, your third slide, please. Could have slide number 3 from Elliot's deck. Because beads are so integral, as your slides demonstrated, to any discussion, I think, of glass in the Atlantic. Well, I mean, this is quite wonderful. Beads are so integral to any discussion of glass in the Atlantic world. And I wondered if you could just share a bit more about what the functions were and how you talked earlier about the itinerary of the object. Maybe you could just say a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think beads are quite extraordinary. As beads, they have many different roles. They're commodities. They are objects of adornment. They're small portable possessions. They're used in rosaries, necklaces. There's in burial contexts. It's just a sort of an extraordinary variety of how they're used, and And the fact that they're so small and portable, it's not just the bead itself, but it's the assemblage of the beads, how they are grouped together and broken apart. They can be, to use like Chapman's words, sort of being chained and fragmented, and they accumulate meaning as they circulate through different contexts. And so, for this, I do use the object itinerary as a concept. Beginning with raw material acquisition, from glass factories to bead factories, which often were different places, and then through transport, and then they come into places in North America and elsewhere in different ways and different contexts, but then they're broken apart. If they come in as strands, these are often broken apart and recirculated and then recontextualized. So beads are just fascinating as an object themselves, and then you add glass to that, and it's even more fascinating because of the properties of glass. Because of these things we've talked about: the shininess, the brilliance, the transparency, the feel of them, the kinds of sounds they make while you're wearing them. They really become this embodied part of your existence when you have these glass beads that you're wearing, as necklaces or bracelets or wristlets, or whatever context they're being used in. So they're quite extraordinary objects, and they can be used to tell stories and explore meanings in all of these different realms.
Of course, they connect. They really connect the Atlantic world. They are prevalent among cultures all around the Atlantic, whether that's Native American or First Nations, African, European, colonial. It seems to be the kind of they form the kind of connective fiber, I think, it seems, for discussion in this context.
Yeah, it's the same, it's the same types, and most of my work is here in the Southeastern US, in the Spanish colonial world, but it's the same types of beads that we see, in British colonial contexts, in Africa. I have a project in Palau and Micronesia, and it's the same types of beads coming from these same European sources that we see in these other colonial contexts, beyond the Atlantic world. So they circulate everywhere and tie everything together.
Yeah, I was interested to he mentioned that the excavations you've been involved with have included Chinese beads as well.
Yeah, in the Mission Santa Catalina assemblage, we have three of these very small, wound, faceted, ruby red, sort of a dusky red colored glass, made with lead. And we think they're Chinese. They look exactly like some that have been recovered from one of the Manila galleon shipwrecks. And so the composition is evocative of Chinese glass, but we don't have really good comparisons from that era. So it's a little complicated, but we're pretty sure they are a Chinese manufacturer. But then, of course, in my work in California, there are Chinese beads that we find in lots of contexts. So, they are continuing to circulate, into the 7th, 18th, and 19th centuries.
Well, that in fact brings me on to two interesting topics. The first is, I think, I kind of couch this in terms that maybe we said the curatorial team at Corning collectively recognized the importance of beads to telling the story of glass across time and place, but it's not a specialism that any of us carry. So I'd like to share with everyone here a new posting for a position at Corning. It's an NEH Public Humanities Fellow for Bead Research, which is putting it in the chat, which has just been posted. So if anyone is watching, has an interest or background in beads and would like to contribute to the museum's understanding of its collection, which I think is fairly broad, please take a closer look and circulate wildly and widely too. We're very excited to bring in this kind of expertise. We have, I think many applied arts collections have collections of beads, because particularly European applied arts, because so many beads were produced in Europe, but they seem to kind of be relegated to so often to storage, and their real significance not really explored in a museum context I'm talking about. I know that the bead community is a huge and thriving community. But anyway, we're looking forward to bringing a new person on board to help guide us. Kerry, did you want to talk about capitalism? That seemed to resonate with you.
Yeah, I'm just sort of typing out an answer to trying to, first of all, to Anne Chang, who asks about how you can tell by looking at the images what kind of glass beads everybody is wearing. So I think it's quite clear, I think, as it can be, that the Roman pearls are Roman pearls in the final image. But certainly in the print by Payot, it's a bit harder to tell if these are painted glass beads, polished glass beads, you know, the kind of opaque ones with a sort of a gleam, but I think we can tell that they are glass beads of some sort, and I think that's why, you know, a lot more work needs to be done, and why Elliot's research is so important. But yes, I did really want to pick up on, you know, if we're thinking about beads and bubbles, because I love Iris's connection of that imagery and the materiality so much. And I just wanted to bring in, you know, the idea of racial capitalism rather than just capitalism to that conversation, because racial capitalism is really the understanding that capitalism emerged specifically as part of a system that made money out of racialized subjects. And in fact, that racialization did begin in Europe. You know, it began arguably in Ireland, where even within Europe, different peoples began to be racialized and extracted from, and then that system, which still relied on feudalism as it began to get going, crosses the Atlantic and becomes exported to Barbados, the Caribbean, and so on. And I know we see the making of race in Caribbean slave laws very specifically, that allow extractive capitalism and that allow partus sequitur fontrum 1662, and that allow chattel slavery. And so it's just to emphasize that I think it's such a wonderful image to think of the bubbles at South Sea bubble, but just to keep in mind that the global aspect of capitalism at this point depends upon its racialization. And I think that's what's so fundamental to these conversations when we're thinking about what glass means, but also how it works as a trading object, how it works as an instrument, and all these different facets.
Yeah, if I can just build on that, Kerry, I think you're absolutely right that the question of race is already there in the 18th century. And you can even read it materially speaking. I mean, if glass is all about the language of luminosity, purity, transparency, and even metal, I mean, you know, because it's called metal, so there is that kind of currency element there as well. But it made me think too about, you know, I'd mentioned 1720 as sort of being the first financial meltdown. Of course, that was called the Mississippi bubble, because they had essentially created a kind of offshore speculation, right, in Mississippi, totally made up, because no one in France even knew what Mississippi really was. But already you're tying in from an imaginary standpoint, right, the Americas into this European context. So I think absolutely this notion of race is already there in the 18th century and operating, like you were saying, on these kind of hierarchies that are there materially.
So we have 7 minutes left, and I would like to, could we go to slide 28, please? And I'd like really to conclude with a discussion around the concept of the Atlantic world. So Elliot and Kerry, you work within this framework quite specifically, but I think in considering glass, I think maybe in some cases it's quite restrictive, because the story of glass during this period connects Asia with America, and Asia with Europe, and Europe with Africa, and so on, east, west, and east. So I wonder if maybe you could, Elliot and Kerry, start maybe by reflecting on your own thoughts of the Atlantic world as a construct, as a framework, and its efficacy and its limitations.
Sure, I can go first. I think the Atlantic world is not a construct that I would necessarily use in my own work, you know, unless it happened to be, you know, in a session or something that is about the Atlantic world. You know, I tend to think, you know, and this is sort of a glass bead centric kind of perspective to it, but I really think of it as a global phenomena. You know, beginning, you know, in the 16th century and onward. It's, you know, it's global from the very beginning. And as we talked about China and, the Manila galleons, and these same materials that are, coming out of Europe and across the Atlantic, but then they're circulating, far beyond the Atlantic, all throughout the interior of North and South America, Western North America, throughout the globe. India, of course, is involved. I think it's far beyond the Atlantic world. And I really try to take a global perspective to, what I try to do with my own work. And I would agree with your suggestion that it might be a little restricted.
Thanks, Elliot.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And you've brought up a vase here. Is it porcelain? Good.
Well, I'm gonna hand it over to after you. I'm gonna hand it over to Iris to give an it's glass, but
it's glass. Okay, so the point about one way I can answer that question is to think of the toilette scene with Belinda at her toilette, and the glass imagery is there, but in the Rape of the Lock also she's metaphorically compared to a china vase and a cracked vase, which signifies her loss of purity, as Iris put, her loss of precisely her loss of virginity. And so I think, we have to situate glass alongside these other textiles, objects and materials, silver too, the silver collars, but then that immediately, as you say, opens out a global perspective. And so as long as we understand the Atlantic as being a frame that inevitably is a connective space, then once we have that flexibility built in, those glass beads are coming across, and could there be more of a search on informing where are those designs coming from? Are there tastes coming in from Orientalism in the 18th century that are feeding into the visuals, the aesthetics of taste in glass? But I think one positive aspect of emphasizing the Atlantic world, Alexi's paper did this, is that it is a site of power in so many ways. And so if we think of it as, and it's really important, as Elliot was talking about, backwaters of Spanish, as so many parts of the landed territories remain backwaters for so long. I think that the emphasis, one of the positive things is to think about the emphasis on this mobile space where the Middle Passage is happening, the transportation of enslaved Africans in millions, that these huge, enormous changes, shifts, violent demands that forge modernity are the Atlantic is the site for that. So I think it's important, and we also have to make sure that we're thinking of it as connected and stretchy.
Thanks, Kerry. Iris, I included this because I know it's a pet subject of yours, and I think it speaks to your interest in the kind of the manufacturing innovations of the Enlightenment that you were alluding to in your panel discussion. And I wondered if for those who are not familiar with opaque white glass of this period, English opaque white glass, you could just briefly explain what it is that we're looking at and how it kind of fits into the kind of the manufacturing world of Britain at that time.
Sure. So again, sort of the variety of glass being made already by the mid 18th century, so it's like 1750 to 65. So this is opaque white glass, sometimes called milk glass, although Nani Frelinghuisen will scream at me if I use milk glass. So opaque white glass, in Italy it's called latimo, but basically imitating porcelain. And again, this whole language of material imitation, spectacle, fancy subjects, transportation to other places through commodities. I mean, it's really all there. And, even just in the realm of the decorative arts, you can think about so many different object itineraries, such a great term, Elliot, and certainly the Atlantic, because I believe what's so great about these pieces that we have in our collection, they're not actually in ESDA, in European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, they're in the American wing, because so many of these were actually exported to the colonies in America. So again, I agree both with Elliot and Kerry. On the one hand, I think the Atlantic is a really great conceptual framework for thinking about the connectedness of everywhere. But on the other hand, following Elliot, it's too restrictive because, I mean, if there's beads from China showing up in America, you know, clearly we have to think much broadly about our context.
So I think that's a great way to round out this discussion. And I suppose my overall takeaway from this session has really, I was really struck by the focus on the performative qualities of glass. So from starting with the expression of politeness, but also the kind of the optical theatricality of the engraved glass that Anna spoke to, and scientific instruments. Science was a sociable pastime of windows, which of course reveal interiors as well as enabling people to look out and to see light, and painted glass, of course. I think it's so much for us to think about, Iris, as museum curators, as we display and try and share the kind of unique, these unique performative qualities with our audiences that would have really struck consumers in the 18th century. But anyway, I think that is all we have time for, because now our director, President and Executive Director Carol White will be joining us to share a few final thoughts.
Thank you, Kit. And hello, everyone. For those who weren't with us at the start of seminar yesterday, I'm Carol White, the President and Executive Director here at the Corning Museum of Glass. The past 2 days of discussions and exchanges have been educational, thought-provoking, and a feast for the eyes. I have truly appreciated the opportunity to listen and learn, and to be able to be engaged on these topics with participants from around the globe. We recognize that it's important for museums to declare their trajectory to themselves and to their communities, no matter where they are on the journey to their realization, as we have tried to do with our institution's equity statement. However, it's events like this and the candid and probing discussions we've heard, particularly the last one, I think, that arise naturally through curiosity, awareness, and respect that mark sustainable and authentic progress, and also highlight how much is still to be done. As we conclude our annual seminar on glass, the 59th, and we look forward to our 60th, we hope to welcome ever more voices to our conversations as collectively we learn about the wonderful material of glass. And we invite your suggestions as to how we might achieve this. So please use the survey you will be sent shortly after this event to share your thoughts. Your feedback always provides valuable insights. Before I hand it back over to Kit Maxwell, I want to thank all of the participants in this year's program, as well as all of you in the audience for your participation. And a special thank you to the team that pulled this program together from inception to completion, in front of the camera and behind the scenes. You've all done a terrific job. And now, Kit, the virtual microphone is yours to take us to this program's conclusion.
Thank you, Carol. Yes, I would like to echo your thanks to our fantastic moderators and all our panelists who have joined us, as I said, across many time zones. And thank you to everyone who has registered to join this seminar, whether you're here live or watching the recording. There were many people who worked behind the scenes to make this seminar possible. As I said yesterday, we've been meeting, almost weekly since the summer to figure out how to launch this event from scratch. We've all learned a lot in the process, and I think we will continue to work on making this a truly accessible event in celebration of glass and glass scholarship. So a particular thank you to all of you who made us aware of your accessibility requirements and worked with us to find solutions. Your patience and goodwill was much, much appreciated. I think these panel discussions have demonstrated that we are still at the foothills of an enormous potential this subject has to offer. There is so much more that we can do, and I hope will do to fill out and problematize our understandings of glass and its global contexts. And I'm, for my part, hugely excited and inspired by the many directions we've seen that this might take. So in wrapping up, everyone who has registered will receive a notification when the recordings of the live panels are ready for viewing. So this notification should come out the next few days. So you can dip back in and feel free to share. And we will also send you notifications of the e-proceedings, which will be launched sometime early next year with papers from all the panelists and moderators you've seen and heard today. I'm also delighted to announce the dates of next year's seminar, our 60th, as Carol mentioned, on 7th and 8th of October, or October 7th and 8th, depending where you are, 2022. And next year has been designated the UN Year of Glass, so you can expect a broad range of topics and discussions over those 2 days, some of which might well pick up on the themes raised today. I would also like to share in the chat details of the Rayqua Research Grant, which has just opened for applications and has a closing date of February 2022. So anyone thinking around the subject of glass, please consider applying for this grant to help in your work. So as Carol mentioned also, we will be sending out a very, very short survey in the coming days to gather responses to this event. And I know it's always an effort to fill out these things, but it has been designed to really take a couple of minutes at most. And your feedback is really, really important to us in helping to develop the program for future years. I hope you will join us again. And wherever you are, thank you very much for joining and enjoy the rest of your weekend and keep it glassy.